Alright, it's time for another JavaScript aside, and this one will be about something that's often misunderstood when it comes to the JavaScript programming language. That's something we need to understand in order to understand things we'll see in Node.js. This is prototypal inheritance and function constructors. But before that, let's define what is the inheritance. That's when an object, one collection of name-value pairs, gets access to the properties and methods, that is, other name-value pairs of another object. So, an object has properties and methods, values and functions attached to it, and your object gets access to the properties and methods of that other object. It inherits those other properties and methods. However, the way JavaScript implements the idea of inheritance is a bit different than other major programming languages out there, but also very powerful because of its simplicity. It implements what's called prototypal inheritance. To explain, let's imagine an object that we have that has some property, some value. Like we showed, first name, last name, that's a property. And we access that property perhaps using the dot. The dot operator, the object prop1. Now, every object has a property that actually points to another object. It's object prototype. It's the thing it inherits from. It's a different object that it will then have access to that other object's properties and methods. And so we could actually say obj.prop2, whatever that other property is on the prototype, and we'll access to it as if it was directly attached to my object. And the prototype also might point to a prototype, its own prototype. A different object might have its own properties and methods, and we can still take my object and say whatever property name, and we'll still have access to it. So it's not just what directly connected to my object, but down what's called a prototype chain. I have a sequence of objects connected to each other, and I can access properties on any of those objects down the line without having to specify which one it is. This is prototypal inheritance, and interestingly, I could make another object a separate object, and it could point to the prototype as other objects do. Actually, it points to the same prototype as these objects do. So they can share properties and methods, and I could change the property or method or add a new property or method to the prototype. And in every object that inherits from it, every object that points to it as its prototype will instantly get access to it. Now, the question is, how do we manage building this prototype chain and constructing our objects? We have already seen the object literal syntax for creating objects, but there are a few ways to create objects in JavaScript that allow us to manage what the prototype is. What object will be the prototype of the object that I'm creating, so I can get access to its properties and methods. There is also a keyword called class. This idea of creating objects based on what's called a class. When we are talking about Node.js, we are going to be looking at something called function constructors. This is another way to create objects and manage what the prototypes are. What are the objects that the objects I'm creating use as their prototype? So let's take a quick look at function constructors as well. But before that, we have a terminology alert. Function constructors. A normal function that is used to construct objects. So we build a function. However, the this keyword that shows up in JavaScript all the time will actually point automatically to a new empty object. And then we can add properties and methods to that new empty object. And that object is returned from the function automatically. And we do this by using the new keyword. So I can say new and then call the function, and what that will do is execute the function. It will take the this keyword make that the new empty object. We can then use the this keyword to construct our object, adding properties and methods to it, and then the function constructor will automatically return that new object from the function call. Alright, let's take a quick look. Once again, I have an empty app.js file and we'll create a function constructor. Now a function constructor is just a regular function. I'll use capital letter to remind myself that it's a constructor. But when this function constructor is called with the new keyword, this variable will automatically be an empty object. So then I can attach things to it. So I might pass into my function constructor some values that I want my object to have. Let's do first name. Then I'll say first name equals to first name. And let's add another property, last name. And then I will set it to this empty object. So I've created a new property on this new empty object, and then I can say, let's say Reza equals to new person, and then I'll say first name is Reza and last name is Arjmandi. Because of I use this new keyword, when it executes this function, it does that special thing that of making this variable an empty object, and it automatically returns it here. So the object that I created, that I added properties to, will be returned here. So if I try that, I can say console.log reza.first name. And if I just in the command line, I say node app.js, I will run it, and here it is. So my object was created and it has those properties I attached to it. And what about the prototype, the thing that this new object I created, Reza, can inherit from? Well, JavaScript provides a way to do this. It's a little confusing, but person prototype. Remember that functions are a special kind of object, so I can have properties and methods in functions as well. And there is a built-in one called prototype. That's just an object, just another object, but I can attach properties and methods to this prototype object as well. So let's make a greet method using a function expression, and I'll just console.log this.first name and plus this.last name. Right, I should say hello. I will concat it with hello string also. So I have a greet function on the prototype. What happens when you use a function constructor is that any object created from the function constructor, its prototype will point to the prototype property of the function that you use to construct the object. So it's a little confusing because the name is prototype, but this isn't the prototype of person. It's the prototype of any object created from person. So I can say now here Reza.greet, and the JavaScript engine will search down the prototype chain because there is no greet method on Reza itself, but there is on its prototype, and then call it. So if I run this node app.js, here it is, hello Reza Arjmandi. So whenever you see the prototype property in code, you know what's happening is we are adding some methods and properties to be available to all objects created from this particular function constructor. So I can create another person object. Let's call it Ali, and I will say new person and say Ali Arjmandi. And Ali also hits access to the greet method because the Ali object's prototype is this same prototype object which has the greet on it. So there is Reza Arjmandi and Ali Arjmandi. And we can actually look at what the prototype is here. Reza._proto. This is not just recommended to use or do in any real production code, but just to show it, there is a special object called _proto__ in the V8 JavaScript engine. And this lets me see what the actual prototype object is. And I can also print it. Let's say, and I can also print the Ali proto. Sorry, I missed I here. So if I run the program again, notice there are both prototype object, and as you can see here, they have the same function, greet function. And the proto property for these two objects should be the exact same object because they were both created from the same function constructor. And I can double check it, but by saying console.log ali._proto, if it equals to Reza_proto object. And let's see if they're equal. Node app.js. Here it is. They're exactly the same. So both Ali and Reza have a prototype, which is this object. And you can see the object here. This is the object, person prototype. It's defined here. And so they both have access to the greet method, because the JavaScript engine searches down the prototype chain to allow Reza and Ali, any objects created from the person function constructor, to have access to inherit these properties and methods from any of those prototypes down the chain. So if this object, person prototype, also had a prototype with a different method on it or a property, the object would still have access to those as well. But the point that we are making here is when you see .prototype here, that's what we are talking about. We are talking about objects and attaching other methods and properties to make available to those objects. Alright, that's enough for prototypal inheritance and function constructors. Let's move on.